Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chat JSB. It's been a minute since I've done one of these, but we have an organist with us. You can usually tell just by looking that they're an organist, but we don't just have an organist. Wesley Hall is also a certifiable TikTok star. So I thought that I would begin with that because I'm fascinated by this project that you've been doing for so long. How did it start, and how many followers do you have, and what do you do in these little TikTok videos?
Well, yeah, TikTok, not something I would have foreseen myself doing, but something that's really interesting, something that speaks to very young people, and something where, like, if you just take out your phone and you point it at an organ console and you show all the bells and whistles and the stops and the gauges and the lights, people just want to see it. They want to know more. It's just visually fascinating, and it worked really well with that medium. And people keep asking for more stuff and I keep making more videos. So it began like many things during the pandemic when we were all kind of tucked away and stuck. And I was in Germany at the time, and I was closed in my house with all my German roommates who spoke no English, and we just had time to kill. And as I was scrolling through TikTok and helping it, using it to help me get through things, I thought, well, what if I made a couple videos myself? And so it grew and continues to grow. I think we're at something like 220,000 followers at this point, and millions and millions of views, and lots of fascinated people.
That's really wild. Wesley, what do they think of the music? Like, what music do you play that tends to get the most hits?
I was shocked by this because, early on, some of the videos that went viral were, you know, swashbuckling organ themes from things like, Pirates of the Caribbean and, the video game Skyrim and things like that. But over time, I started playing a few other things and saying, well, let's check out how a fugue works, or let's maybe look at a little bit of this. And a surprising number of people say, let's hear the whole thing. And okay, well, in this little medium that we have for these quick, often funny videos or dance videos or whatever, here's a Bach fugue for 4 minutes, and people will watch it. And sometimes tens and tens of thousands of people will watch it, which blows my mind. But you never know. And I mean, there have been videos where you just hold up a pair of organ shoes and it's like 2 million views. Tell me about organ shoes. So you can't predict this stuff.
It's really funny. I have full disclosure. I'm a pianist who plays organ in church. And for all you young musicians out there, particularly keyboard players, pick up this skill because you make way more as a church organist than you will ever make waiting tables. Like, I'm just so lucky that I had a teacher who said, you might as well at least learn how to move your feet a little bit. And the funny thing for me is that I still have that feeling when I sit down at an organ console. They're extraordinary machines, aren't they?
They are. I think, we'll talk about Bach, of course, but I think he's a prototype in many ways of being so into the music. Obviously, this mind for counterpoint and this love of music on a deep level that probably none of us can ever understand, but also fascinated with the mechanics of it and just like how this machine works. And I think him being as famous in his own lifetime or more as an instrument expert
Yeah.
and someone who would come and test new instruments and who you'd want to come say, oh, this is a good organ, or this organ, it needs a little work on its lungs.
Yeah.
He was always had that fascination. I think that was a prototype for a lot of people who say, okay, the organ is this Wizard of Oz, man behind the curtain thing, but what you create with it is very grand and very impactful. It's also its greatest challenge, as you well know, because you can easily give into the siren call of being a machine operator,
Yeah.
and you can forget there's so much between you and making the music. It's electric relays, or it's these trackers, and the pipes are a football field away, and you have all this stuff to do. So it's a perennial challenge of the organist, is to balance both, is to understand the mechanisms, the machinery, and somehow be able to float through that and make music.
With my organist friends, I believe you are supposed to use this voice when you talk about the mechanics of the instrument. People get yeah, exactly. People get really like if you for those of you who are unlucky in that you don't have any organist friends, man, it's like the Venn diagram between the kids who played with the Erector set and the kids who end up as organists
It's a
is
circle.
it
It's
is
a
a circle.
circle.
Hey, so let's Wesley, we are going to talk about a few different things. We talked about the TikTok. Oh, where can we send people before China takes TikTok away from us? Where can we send them to find this?
Well, my handle
Thank you.
uh, is at West Piper, and this all stems from me misspelling my name in video games as a child. And I would type Westley, and then it became West. And pipes, I play the bagpipes, I play the pipe organ, so I'm on everything at West Piper.
Awesome. So go check it out. I've yet to dive into TikTok. I'm kind of scared to join, but I think for you I will have to. So we've talked about that. You touched for 1 second on a small port city in Germany called Lübeck. And we're going to come back to that because what you guys need to know is what I really bonded with Wesley over is our shared love of a composer called Dietrich Buxtehude. Excuse me, I was going to put an umlaut on something that doesn't have an umlaut. And he's a hugely important figure. And I'm going to come back to that because Wesley spent a big chunk of his COVID time living there. But let's for a second, because you did talk about the mechanics and you did talk about Bach. Can you go down this rabbit hole for a moment of Bach as organist, maybe even principally as organist in his own mind, and what he did for the repertoire that made it so much more difficult than anything that had come before, and that remains that there are aspects of the repertoire that remain almost unplayable for all but the most advanced organists. Can you just talk about that? I'll just wind you up and let you go.
I would be happy to. I mean, as you know, you can never talk too much about Bach, and no one has all the answers. And it is so true that you will see people having these just heated and spirited debates about different elements of Bach's work hundreds of years later, and the greatest experts in the world not fully agreeing and having totally different opinions on how he got there. There's something to it. Um, I think that Bach lived in a very interesting time span. So like there are a lot of shifts and the world changes a lot between, 1685 and 1750. I think that he experienced a lot of different types of music. Obviously, Lubeck is going to be a big part of this story because, as you mentioned, it's a port city and has influences of trade and global. He's has all this exposure to Italian music. But when you look at his compositions as a whole, there are times where he's just in Italian mode and he's just doing it's just chamber music floating out of the keys. And the top line in your hand is just like a solo violin playing a little, it's like a concerto grosso. And then there are these times where he's deep in church mode and where he's just he's doing text painting on a level that it sometimes took people like generations to see. And oh, this is the cross, or oh, this is this concept that's building and the spirit is rising up. There's straight up counterpoint Bach, where he's just this, like you said, this theorist, kind of math nerd kind of guy. And then I do think there are times where he just wants to do just big, loud noise. Like there are times where he just wants to do fireworks. And I mean, even outside of just the organ, it's, Brandenburg 5, the harpsichord is just smashing around and flying all over the keys and making a crashing sound of runs. And he does that sometimes with the organ too. Uh, I guess, in short, he's got all these different national styles hitting him, but also the past. He's very interested at times in this very antique style, which, later theorists are saying, well, how did he prophesy these harmonies? There are some
Oh,
moments in Klavierübung 3 where it's like, we didn't see these harmonies again until Max Reger,
yeah.
but he wasn't a prophet. He's going back and he's digging to pre-tonality. And so, that becomes so fascinating for people where he's kind of old-fashioned in a way, but he's doing that in the time of absolute contrapuntal mastery and in a time where people are seeing it and have just forgotten and lost touch with the antique style and saying, okay, he's a prophet. and it means he's doing it in a way that people hadn't done it before. So, that's where all the fun stuff comes from of, okay, here's a Neapolitan chord, but it's not in first inversion, it's not a predominant, and this is functionless, and what's he doing? And well, he's just stepping into the past a little bit. So I think you see three dimensions of styles across Europe and also past and future.
I'm just going to jump in only for the people who've been following along, particularly Bach 101. Everything that Wesley just said is another way of stating what I keep saying, that Bach was North German, was French, and was Italian. And it's his specific ability to combine those. And yet, as you say, sometimes he was purely North German. And that North German, I think of, as that very ascetic, very Lutheran, all about sin.
Yes.
Let's not enjoy ourselves here.
Right. Yes.
Something you just said struck me. Could be a ridiculous question, but when you said just making all that noise, when you think about I don't want to say pre-industrial. Obviously, it was at an industrial age, but it was sort of pre-factory noise and obviously pre any kind of automobile and things like that. Strikes me for the people where Bach lived and worked. Do you think the organ might have been the loudest thing that they ever encountered?
That is a fascinating thought. And I think so. I mean, it's certainly the most technologically advanced thing you would have had exposure to, that and clocks. And they're often putting clocks in organs to show you how wealthy and erudite the city is. But I think so, and also because some of these spaces, the ones he discovers, especially in Lübeck, are incredibly reverberant, and the sound is sort of amplified, and you can hear this great loud sound, football fields away up in the chancel, and
Yes.
the effect is that it is incredibly. I bet it is. I mean, we're even pre like ship foghorns and things too.
Yes.
I think it probably
Isn't
was.
that
That's an
funny?
interesting
Because
note.
these are the irreproducible things about history that until you think about them, you're missing a really salient fact. Like, for example, those cathedrals, the medieval cathedrals, were not just enormous. They were by factors of 50, the most enormous thing anybody would ever see. And you would see them from miles and miles and miles away.
Yes,
And
yes.
we
Oh,
can't reproduce that idea now.
no,
We
we
can't produce
can't.
that joy, the pure joy. As I said, I'm a pianist who plays organ. One of the things I love to do, it was just Easter yesterday. I just love to open up. I happen to the organ at the church where I play is a very large instrument, and I still thrill to the sound of what is called organo pleno, the full organ. It's just amazing.
It
And
it
he
really
did,
is.
right? Like even in these fugues, which are so intricate, there would often come near the end that what I like to call the ecstatic moment, that where
Hmm.
everything sort of catches fire. And part of that is probably put
Brilliant.
on a lot of stops, right?
That's really brilliant. And I'm thinking about this as you say it, the moment in a fugue of like a stretto at the end where all of the lines come back and it's almost like you've had each time is like a cannon firing with each subject as it appears. But then the stretto happens at the end and they come firing faster and faster and stacking on themselves, and it's literally more lines and more sound. And you might add stops as well. So you're physically building up the sound, but you're also stacking these lines and you're building up the volume with just more notes. And that's a brilliant
I
thought.
love those moments. I love those moments. Now you can use the organist's voice if you would like to, but you don't have to. Can you explain to everybody what are the most significant fundamental differences between the organ of Bach's time and the modern organ, including this idea of the tracker and what that means?
Yes, and with the caveat that how an organ works inside is one of my weakest areas. I know a little bit, and in some ways enough to be dangerous. I do appreciate there are a lot of organ builders on TikTok, and they will very kindly pop into the comments and say, "Hey there, I appreciate it. Mostly right. Just a quick note. This isn't quite how this works." And so I've actually learned a bunch myself in the process.
Organists are not known for keeping their constructive criticism to themselves.
That's true. That is very true. So we talked earlier about the organ being a machine and always at the forefront of technological development. In Bach's day, this is the word tracker instruments, and you can think of them like popsicle sticks, like little thin pieces of wood, and you have a physical connection to the keys. And so when you press a key, it's literally a lever, and you can convert that motion and send it anywhere you want to through rollerboards. So you turn a little dowel, and that dowel will then, in the opposite direction, move the next tracker, and so forth. Now, the further you go, and the more distance and the more wood you are pushing physically, the more weight there is to the keys. But um, builders, as they kept increasing the size of instruments, found out all these clever ways to mitigate that. And so you have this spectrum where you go from the ancient medieval Blockwerk to, okay, well, let's split the stops up, and now you can draw out individual pitch classes on top of the key you're playing. The organs get bigger and bigger and bigger. Eventually, the French builders, Cavaillé famously creates these little pneumatic pouches of air that literally make it easier for you to play huge numbers of stops with a huge amount of weight. And then finally, there's electrification, and that hits, late 19th century into the 20th century, and a lot of older organs are electrified. And then you can kind of do anything. The organ enters a new era of being a technological marvel in the roaring 20s and the teens, and you have all these bells and whistles literally and gauges, and you can couple anything anywhere, and you can put pipes wherever because you just have to get chords there, and then you have a primitive circuit board, and you're playing real pipes but through an electronic mechanism. How's that for the quick nerd warm up?
That's actually really great. And as a side note, I understand. So the hook organ at Mechanics Hall, which people will hear all the way throughout the complete Bach, um, is famously heavy action, isn't it?
It is, and it's that organ. I mean, first of all, that organ is all over the world. It's just called the Worcester organ. It's,
Oh, right.
people who know that style, like people will know that in Italy and France and Germany call it the Worcester organ because this is a perfectly preserved, I think 1861 American orchestral instrument that was really untouched. It is mechanical though, and that means you have all this physical stuff you have to do. And so I will say that's organists view that as a trip to the gym.
Yeah. Is it pre-pneumatic, Wesley?
It is.
Oh my
Well,
gosh.
sorry, it is around the time, but there was a particular French builder who's using these pneumatic pouches called Barker levers, and I don't believe it has any assistance like
Proof.
that.
It's
But
it would be awesome if everybody could have a chance at some point because I think you'd be really surprised how heavy a tracker action is, and they're also kind of clunky just because of the way the mechanism works. Whereas the modern one is like, which I have at my church, is like
yeah,
playing a synthesizer. There's in fact it can be a little problematic because it's so easy to
so
play.
light and easy to play. Yeah, so they are heavy, the big, huge ones that got created towards the end, but some of them are very delicate. And that we talk about early fingerings and then more modern fingerings, piano centric, pivoting over the thumb. But in early fingerings on some of these instruments from the 16th century, early 17th century, they're actually very small keys, and they are pretty light. And you can play thirds and just take two fingers and just keep playing those two fingers side by side by side and just sort of dance across it.
Oh wow.
Um, but again, as the technology and they build bigger and bigger instruments, those become very heavy, and that necessitates development. Um, Here at the church where I work here, First Baptist, we have both in the sanctuary. One is a tracker. It's British made in the 20th century, but in a very German Baroque style, and so we call it a British or a German organ with a British accent. And then the organ in the front is very much, I think, like what you have at your parish, with multi tiers of
It's
keyboard.
a great instrument. And I should say the reason that we're talking to Wesley, though I would anyway, is that he is playing Peter Krasinski played the first organ recital to kick us off at the start of the year. He is the organist at Mechanics Hall. And Wesley is the first of our local organists to show off our instruments. Because although it is true that the hook organ is the Worcester organ around the world, what we know is that the different churches in town have really wonderful, there's an embarrassment of riches, wonderful, but also very, very different style instruments. So we can show them off in different ways. And as Wesley hinted, the other thing, which is at least as important and maybe even more important than the instrument itself, is the room that
Hmm.
we're built for. The organ at my church, we're in discussions right now about doing some stuff because they put asbestos on the ceiling in the 1920s because the preacher couldn't be heard in this wobbly acoustic. And of course, an organ needs a wobbly acoustic to give it that bloom around the sound. And we think that Bach's church, which has been redone itself over the years, in Leipzig, St. Thomas was probably a much more live acoustic than it has ended up being now, even though it's live enough.
It's it's so true. And if actually if we can pivot to Germany and Bach's kind of acoustical experiences for a moment, I think as much as the instrument and Buxtehude himself during Bach's visit changed him and became this sort of thing for him, the rooms themselves were a huge part of this because I mean, you think about before he's in Arnstadt, he's in when Thuringia, and it's more rural,
Yep.
and he's as a kid he's not in these huge mega centers, and Lübeck today is a small city, but at the time, they called it the crown of the Hanseatic League, and the scale of these churches, like to this day, when you see it from a distance, it's these seven spires that are all about the same height, and it looks like a skyline of a city. And so you
That's,
actually, when you were talking earlier about this effect of, well, we've seen skyscrapers, how can a church impress us and strike us in the same way? I have to say, if you picked up Saint Mary's, the Marienkirche in Lübeck, where Buxtehude was organist, if you picked that up and you dropped it in the financial district of Boston, it would be taller than some of the skyscrapers.
oh, wow.
Like
Oh, I didn't
those
realize.
towers, those towers are literally 40 stories high.
Oh my gosh.
And you have that effect. Like so I lived across the street from where Bach stayed when he was there. And if you walk out the door and you stand under the steeples, like you see that it feels like they're moving and the clouds are like it still fills you with that kind of animal sense of awe. And you could just pick up any church in Worcester and just set it inside the sanctuary
Oh
with
my
the steeple and
God.
all, right?
Oh, I didn't realize it was that big. Let me do
So
two quick, sorry,
yes, yes, yes,
quick explanations, and then I'll wind you up again to talk about books to Huda.
yes.
First of all, for those of you who are dorky enough really to listen to my Bach 101s from start to finish, I talk about the free imperial cities quite a lot.
Mm.
And of course, this is hugely important for why Lübeck and the Hanseatic League was so important because they didn't have a duke or a prince over them. And so those cities were incredibly commercial and were incredibly proud of themselves. There was this extraordinary civic pride because they didn't have an overlord. And this was really important for why Lübeck was so important. Now, the other thing I want to say, if you've heard about Lübeck in Buxtehude, you have heard the story, which is true, that Bach walked the 200 miles there and back, and he overstayed his leave from work and was put in prison. Now, the thing is, that's funny because it shows you how his employers never really respected Bach. But let's put that to one side because that's not the important thing about Buxtehude in Bach's life. Buxtehude was a hugely influential composer for all of them, but particularly for us because of Bach. So now you can talk about Dietrich Buxtehude and,
I
and
love
his
anytime
and his unmarriageable daughter.
and it oh boy, yes, lots of stories. Um yeah, I mean, so I'm always happy to talk about Buxtehude. I think he was important for a lot of reasons. I mean, one of them is just that he was famous as an organist and that he played concerts and that he set up this kind of model of being like the director of music at this church and in sort of in charge of the music that happens and also going and doing his own stuff. And that is what Bach did in Leipzig ultimately. Like Bach's job in Leipzig really reflects the kind of independence and freedom that Buxtehude had at the Marienkirche. But and also it's fascinating to think about how that free city ethos was just sort of in the water in Lubeck. Bach was clearly fascinated by that. I mean, Wolf goes so far as to describe Buxtehude as a father figure for Handel and for Bach. He uses the phrase father figure. He's in his 60s when Bach comes to visit as a young man, and he's sort of, here's how things work, and I'll show you, and come see. You can play these huge instruments here and everything. So but someone who's writing amazing chamber music, who's doing choral works, who also, though, can just throw his head back and write these Stilus Fantasticus organ pieces that are just organ for its own sake, sort of very just impressive. And so I think when Bach gets there, his mind is blown by the scale of these rooms. The acoustic is unreal because they're built out of brick. Everything's brick in Lubeck. They had this it wasn't stone. They're building these bricks and they're incredibly reverberant. And so this combination of these giant rooms coming from this wealth and freedom of the free cities, these organists like Buxtehude who has the freedom to compose and play what he wants, and the fact that there's global influence and that you can find there in Buxtehude's writing like the freedom of the Italian toccata, but the grandeur of this space and the precise counterpoint of a kind of Germanic ethos. So Bach's only seen kind of smaller scale rooms, shorter acoustics, and so forth when he gets there. He gets there, and I think he overstayed the time he told his church he would be gone. I think he probably left to return around the time he was supposed to be back, and it was hundreds of miles away. Um, and like you see some changes in his music, in his organ music. It clearly was a very impactful time
Is it
in his
true,
life.
Wesley, that Buxtehude was really the avatar of extraordinary pedal writing?
I would say he's the greatest form of that. Um,
So
and
did that influence Bach? Like, do we see a big difference before and after with Bach's pedal writing?
we do. I'm so actually, if I can detour for a moment to the concert, I'm excuse me, going to play this weekend.
Good.
I've chosen to end the program with an early Bach work because I think in some ways it's the most impressive and the grandest one. Formally, it's old-fashioned. It's a little bit simpler. The fugue is not as intricate as something like the wedge or, the famous G minor fugue or something, but it's just powerful and the pedals are wild and they're pedal solos. And this is a piece that's totally like what he writes when he comes back from seeing Buxtehude.
Yep. Yep. And we
Yeah.
won't go down this rabbit hole, but as a choral person, what fascinates me is you can tell which cantatas he wrote co coming back from Lübeck as well. And the stuff that he wrote in Leipzig really is not
Interesting.
much like those early ones. It's one of the few times I've said in Bach 101 that the interesting thing about Bach is that his compositional voice is extremely consistent from the beginning of his life all the way through, but there are some formal shifts that happen. And you could make the argument that of all the influences that he experienced, Buxtehude is the greatest of the pivots in both those directions.
I think I think so. First of all, I just want to talk to you sometime and learn about those influences in the cantatas because cantatas are a weak point for me. I've played the ones I've played and I listened to the ones I've listened to. I don't think I've ever heard every single one. So I'll be attending
You
a lot of
will
concerts over the next
go by the
decade.
next decade. And by the way, I do have to say, Wesley knows this. He played continuo in our last. Playing continuo means playing generally a smaller organ or a harpsichord, and it's hugely improvisational. Bach would have just written a bass note, just like jazz. If you've seen guitar chords, tabs, it's the exact equivalent of it. It just tells you what chord to play. It just looks a little bit different. Um, and Wesley's such a great improviser on these that I actually started laughing out loud because of something wild that he did. So he
Well,
will
I
be
appreciate
playing.
that. I will say we take our inspiration also from the conductor, and if the conductor's showing you some of this, you'll do a little bit of that as well.
It is surprisingly that relationship is really collaborative, and Mark
Yes.
Mummer and I have that relationship. But you will learn a lot of cantatas over the next 11 years. But it is interesting because they are these two And it's funny because, in a way, you can make an argument that the organ oeuvre, the whole sort of 24 hours of organ music, and then these 200 cantatas are actually probably the pillars that show most
Hmm.
who Bach really was as a musician, but they are actually much less well known than the
Huh.
keyboard suites, than the
Right.
Brandenburg Concerti, which we love, but those are not, I don't think, this is, I'm way out on over my skis on this, but I would say I don't think he's amazing. He's a great
Yes.
writer of the pieces like that. But I think that the fundamental essence of who Bach was as a man, as a Christian, and as a composer are actually in those two pillars, but they're in a sense the least well known by even general Bach lovers of all his repertoire. I'm just going to
Uh,
say, I don't.
yeah, I think you're right about that, and it's making me reflect on I mean, people will maybe have heard of this Klavierübung 3, this collection of organ pieces, and there's the St. Anne Prelude and Fugue that comes from that. But one of my favorite things to do, and I would do this at conservatory, I will do it to this day for friends of mine who are incredible musicians, who are string players or whatever, who love Bach. And I'll say, have you ever heard this? And they will not have even heard of this suite. And then I'll bring this piece to them and I'll say, listen to where the harmonies go on this last page. And every single time, unwaveringly, people have this like experience where they just like mouths open, just I can't believe what's happening. And do I even know who Bach is? And it's just a random organ piece from a random set, right? So they're tucked away and hidden in that 20 hours. Yeah.
Like you said about Rager, and I apologize to everybody. This is a bit in the weeds, but there'll be a lot of you who will know what we mean by this. There are sections of individual pieces from time to time that use so many, we say highly chromatic. What it means is so many sharps or flats in chords that don't have any kind of function that our ears understand. Like Mozart, that great genius, and he lived in a time where they just didn't go there. They didn't go to that kind of chromaticism. In the age of rationality, they wanted their
Yes.
harmony to be really clear. Bach does these things that you can't believe it's not Schoenberg or Rager or Webern. It's
Literally.
insane,
Literally.
insane.
Yes. Literally. And the fact that people who are incredibly learned in music, who have many degrees in performance and have studied Bach for hours, have never heard some of this, never once. They're hidden in plain sight, you know?
By the way, it's not beautiful. Like these are not the most beautiful phrases that they're quite literally thorny. And as Wesley said, and you guys have heard me talk about this, it's really only the last 50 years that we realize that when he does that, highly chromatic stuff, it is almost always to express some kind of theological or scriptural thing. Like if you're talking about the way of the cross, then you're going to put in uh, kreuzes, the Doppelkreuz. You're going to put in these crosses with the sharps and the X, and you're going to make it sound thorny. It's there. You think of the Crucifixus from the B minor Mass, which is a descending by half step. There's actually a word for that. It's called the passus durisculsus, which is the very difficult way. And you learn one fact like that, and you think, do I even know this guy? Like one little
Yes.
thing, and he knew 100 of those little things. It's like being in a relationship with somebody, and one day you look at them and think, I don't even know.
Yes. Who
You're
are
so
you?
much, you're so much more than I ever knew you were. Um, Wesley, as you know, there actually legal requirement that when you talk about organ music, you can't go over a certain number of minutes. And so I'm
Right.
just wanted just to save our people, you know.
Yes.
So
Yes.
so I so I'm going we're going to wrap up, but I will absolutely have you on again. And for the people who have been following Bach 101s, I regret because there have been so many things to cover in this first year of that course. I haven't even really gotten to I've touched on the idea of what a chorale prelude is. We've certainly talked about fugues, and find the one where Wesley very kindly recorded that G minor, that little G minor fugue, which is a perfect. Some of his fugues are just perfect fugues, and they start and
Yes.
end at the exact right time, and that is one of them. But there's so much more to talk about. We have not even talked about something that's called the Trio Sonata, which if
Ugh.
you listen to an organist play, you would have no idea how difficult these things are.
That's the thing. That is the brutality. It's you're locked in and you're trying to just get through it. And so differently, it just sounds delightful and beautiful and just nice, you know.
When I met with all the organists early on in this project to talk about how to sort of divvy up with a lot of the music, we are being I'm forcing an encyclopedic uh, structure, like all the partitas that Jeremy Dank played.
Right.
Vladimir playing all the cello suites. That doesn't work so well with the organ. What really works well is to hear a program like Wesley's going to play with some chorale preludes, some preludes and fugues or fantasia and fugue, and then maybe, for some
Yeah.
programs a trio sonata. But what I loved was when I talked about the project and this encyclopedic approach to a person, all the organists are like, nobody's going to want to listen to the six trio sonatas in one program.
Nope. Nope. Never. I know we're wrapping up. Can I just ask you one quick question?
Yeah, absolutely.
When you were at Yale, when were you there relative to the Neumeister chorale discoveries?
Oh, yes. And here I sit in my friend's house in Boston. So it's particularly galling that you would ask this question. How dare you? How dare you, Wesley?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
In the
You can just
greatest
message me. You can just send the you just put it in the text
in
box.
the greatest example, now, first, I should say, people almost never, it's just like Shakespeare, the chances of finding new Bach works are infinitesimally small. And when you do, it's a really big deal. But Christoph Wolff, the greatest of the Bach musicologists of the moment, was poking through, as one does, an archive at Yale. But he is famously Harvard. He's held all these positions at Harvard. And hidden in the papers of a guy called Lowell Mason, a great musician and music educator, um,
Yep.
at Yale, he found this collection of chorale preludes that are so early, and they must be pre-Buxtehude because they're
Oh
just
yes.
pure
Oh,
North German. Now, I know them because as a shabby organist, I can play them because they're quite simple
and they're beautiful. They're
and they're beautiful.
stunning and elegant. They're lovely.
So I was still an undergrad, and then I started at Yale when they were still smarting from having been pipped at the post. What is your relationship to the Neumeister chorales, Wesley?
Well, I was connecting it back to your time there. I was at Yale in the 20 teens, but I play some of these and I'm going to offer a couple of them on this program this weekend. So we'll kind of run the gamut from these early pieces that in the grand scheme of things were just discovered, and we'll go to sort of late stuff, but I was just curious there how that
Yeah,
tied
and I
in.
love that because when you sent your program over, I thought, he's going to play the only ones that I can play in public. We did I'll finish with this. There is a bit of a tradition. If anybody's wondering why we're behind with the organ works, whereas we're caught up, percentage wise, year by year with everything else, it's because there's a really lovely tradition in the organ world to do these 24-hour marathon of all Bach's organ works. And we won't do that, but it means that some year, in order to catch up to everything else, we can do a 4-hour marathon. I was just
Yep.
talking to Peter Krasinski. Everybody can bring their blanket and lie down on the floor of Mechanics Hall as we shunt different organists
Yeah.
in and
Yes.
out to play. And
Yep.
the reason I mention it is I was part of one of these in Sydney, and there's something called which you obviously know, Wesley, called manualiter, which means manuals only, and they let me. They let me play the Manuelator movements.
Yes. Oh, perfect. Oh, delightful.
I'm really excited about this program, and congratulations on the new organ, which has been installed now.
It's all installed. It's been finalized and put into a very accurate historical temperament that would have been very familiar to Bach. It's a half sort of fifth comma mean tone, and so the chords that are supposed
I'm
to be
sorry, that's pronounced fifth comma mean
oh
tone.
yeah, it's the fifth comma mean tone. That's true. And it makes the music come alive. Even these sort of simple harmonies will sound the way they were supposed to sound. It's really you feel like
That,
you're listening to the past.
by the way, that is a whole Zoom that we can do at your church and you can play,
Oh,
because
fun.
that's another thing, just like seeing the cathedral in the distance or knowing that the organ is super loud, that until you've experienced the way that they tuned, you have no idea. Each chord was either a good chord or a bad
Or
chord.
a very bad
Oh,
chord.
hugely bad chord. Yeah,
Yes.
a honky tonk chord. By the way, I
Oh,
had to ask this. Are you going to play both instruments on Sunday?
yes. In fact, we'll begin on the wood organ, newly rededicated in the rear gallery, and then we'll move to the big monster, huge four manual beast in the front with the console pulled around so you can see everything.
I can't wait. And listen, thank you. And everybody, can I just say, if you have not gotten into organ music, now is the time. This next decade, you are going to hear some of the greatest organ music ever written. So just
Yeah.
strap in and don't worry that it is a little off-putting at first. The organ is one of those instruments that it's not necessarily hugely welcoming at first. I hope you don't mind me saying that,
No,
Wes.
I no, I know what
That's
you
what your
mean.
TikToks are about, isn't it? In a sense, that there's you feel literally, but also almost metaphorically, you feel a bit of a distance from this because it is a
Yeah.
machine. But if
Yeah.
you allow yourself to get into it, it does pay. It does pay off. I promise. And
Yes.
go to TikTok.
Yes, right. Absolutely. Check out Anna Lapwood is
Oh,
exploding British organist. She was over here a couple years ago. We made some videos together and she played these organs and I'm sure she'll be back sometime, but
and
check her
Anna
out.
came to my church as well, so we
Oh,
have to
good.
get back for the complete box. She is such an
Oh,
advocate
great.
of the instrument as well.
Perfect. That'll be great.
Cool. Okay,
Wonderful.
well, I'm going to hang up on Wesley and tell everybody to go to TikTok right now. Don't worry about the Chinese government; they're not watching you.
They're not watching you. Don't worry.
They're too busy watching West Pipes play the organ. We'll see you on Sunday. Thank you,
All
everybody.
right. Thank you, Chris.
Bye.
Bye-bye.